In this module today, we're trying to understand why the Gospel of John is so different from the Synoptics. And I would like to suggest that one of the reasons John is so different from the Synoptics is the way in which it understands the role of the Holy Spirit in leading the Johannine community into ongoing revelation about the nature of Jesus, about the relationship that Jesus, as the embodiment of God's Son, has with the Father. So we have to pay very close attention to what the Gospel of John says about the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit, which the Gospel of John identifies as the Paraclete in chapters 14, 15, and 16 of the Gospel of John. The language about the Paraclete, then, is found in the second half of the Gospel, in that section of the Gospel that we've been identifying as the Book of Glory. In the 13th chapter of the Gospel of John, Jesus has a final meal with his disciples. This final meal is not a Passover meal in John's Gospel. At this final meal with Jesus' disciples, he does not initiate the Lord's Supper, at which he identifies the bread that he breaks at the Passover meal and the cup of wine that he shares with the disciples with his body and blood. In the Gospel of John, there is no initiation of the Last Supper or the Eucharist in this Gospel. There is something similar to that going on in chapter 6 when Jesus feeds the 5,000, but there is no Last Supper as a Passover meal in John's Gospel because John is working with a different calendar. Jesus celebrates a final meal with his disciples, but it is not a Passover meal because Passover does not begin until Friday evening in John's Gospel. Passover coincides with the onset of Sabbath in John's Gospel after Jesus has already died. In John's Gospel, Jesus dies on Friday, to be sure, but Passover has not yet started. Jesus dies when the Passover lambs are being slaughtered, and John has a particular interest in identifying Jesus as the equivalent of the Passover lamb, which means that for John's Gospel, Jesus has to die before Passover actually commences. So Jesus has had simply a regular supper with his disciples, and at this regular supper he gives a farewell, a valedictory discourse to his disciples, summing up his ministry, talking about his relationship to the Father, and talking about his hopes for the community that he will soon be leaving behind. And in chapter 14 of John's Gospel, he promises that after his crucifixion, that he will ask the Father, and the Father will send to this community that Jesus has left behind the Paraclete, another expression of God's being, another embodiment or spiritual expression of God's being. So Jesus says this in chapter 14, starting with verse 15. If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And of course that is the commandment to love one another. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another Paraclete. Another Paraclete. The first Paraclete being Jesus himself, but this is another Paraclete. Now, the translation that we are using for this class, that is edited by Bart Ehrman, translates the Greek word parakletos, what I'm calling Paraclete, as advocate. We think of advocate usually in legal terms. An advocate is one who pleads our case for us in a trial of law. And certainly parakletos in Greek has that connotation. If you look at other translations, for example, the translation which is called the Bible in today's English, or the Good News Bible, it translates parakletos as helper. And that's a pretty good translation too. Or if you look at the King James Bible, it translates parakletos as the comforter, because parakletos can be understood as one who provides comfort. The word parakletos in Greek means one who is called beside. And so it can have all of those meanings: advocate, helper, comforter. But in John's Gospel, the one who is called beside is this spiritual presence of God within the community that Jesus has called together. And this spiritual presence has a certain set of functions that Jesus describes in more and more detail as these chapters of the farewell discourse unfold in chapters 14, 15, and 16 of John's Gospel. So here in chapter 14, Jesus says, "I will ask the Father, and he will give you another paraclete to be with you forever. This paraclete is the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him or knows him." Jesus says later on in chapter 14, "I have said these things to you while I am with you, but when the Paraclete comes, the Holy Spirit." So here now he tells us that the Paraclete is the Holy Spirit, "whom the Father will send in my name. He will teach you everything, and he will remind you of all that I have said to you." So the Paraclete has this function of reminding the Jesus followers of what Jesus has said. So the Paraclete serves to remind the community of the Jesus tradition. It is to keep the Jesus tradition alive. In chapter 15, then, Jesus goes on to say, this is at the very end of chapter 15, in verse 26, "When the Paraclete comes, who I will send to you from the Father, the Spirit of truth, when the Paraclete comes, he will bear witness on my behalf." He will testify on my behalf, and you also are to testify because you have been with me from the beginning. So the Paraclete will bear witness to Jesus. It will testify to Jesus. What does that mean? What does it mean that the Paraclete will bear witness to Jesus? Well, in chapter 16, Jesus once again talks about the Paraclete, and he says this, "I have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them. But when the Paraclete comes, the Spirit of truth, the Paraclete will guide you into all truth. He will not speak on his own, but he will speak whatever he hears. He will declare to you the things that are to come. He will glorify me, because he will take what is mine and declare it to you. All that the Father has is mine, and for this reason I say that he will take what is mine and declare it to you." What the Gospel of John is saying is that the Paraclete has the function of ongoing revelation, a deepening understanding of who Jesus is, of what Jesus' relationship to the Father is, of what the meaning of Jesus' mission was and continues to be within this community. The Paraclete, yes, keeps alive the tradition of Jesus, but the Paraclete leads the community into all truth. The Paraclete provides ongoing revelation, a deeper revelation of who Jesus is. The Gospel of John doesn't simply see the Paraclete's role as calling to memory who Jesus was, of keeping in mind the historical record, but deepening and enriching and transforming that historical record. The Gospel of John is not simply about keeping alive a historical tradition of Jesus, but rather a living tradition about Jesus, a deepening tradition about Jesus, so that the community of the beloved disciple that the fourth gospel gives us some insight into is insight into ongoing revelation about Jesus. So, unlike the synoptic gospels, it's not simply interested on the one hand in just the historical Jesus, but the living Jesus, the Jesus who reveals the Father, the living Jesus whom the Paraclete continues to reveal new truths about. If you understand that, you understand why the Gospel of John is so different. So that when you get to the end of the Gospel of John, to chapter 20 and to chapter 21, it can say this about what it hopes to do, what it preserves, but what it points beyond itself to. This is what the end of chapter 20 of the Gospel of John said. Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, but they are not written in this book. These, just these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and through believing you may have life, present tense, not in the future, but present tense, in his name. The Gospel of John is selective. It's not concerned to write about everything that Jesus did and said. It believes that the community that keeps alive even a few of these traditions will be led into further truth by the Paraclete. But enough is given in order that the community that holds on to the tradition of Jesus may be brought into a relationship with the Father, a transformative relationship, so that people who believe can enter into a relationship to the Father similar to the relationship that Jesus enjoys with the Father. Then look again at the end of chapter 21, where the Gospel concludes. It says, there are many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that could be written. The Gospel of John is selective in what it preserves, but it also includes this notion of the work of the Paraclete that has the function not only of calling to mind the historical Jesus, but calling believers into an ongoing revelation of Jesus and Jesus' relationship to the Father, so that those who believe in Jesus may be brought into a relationship to the Father and transformed by that relationship into a recognition of God's creative activity in the present.